It was a night like no other in the glittering sprawl of the galaxy's most opulent star system, Selexia Prime. The shimmering nebulae in the skies above served as a backdrop to the dazzling lights of the royal palace, its crystalline spires glowing with an ethereal luminescence. Inside, the great hall of proposals was alive with the murmur of hopeful suitors and the sharp, judgmental gazes of the court's elite. Tonight was the final attempt for the galaxy's most eligible royal, Princess Kalara of the Xantharian Empire, to select her consort, a decision that had captivated billions across the stars. Kalara sat on an ornate throne carved from iridescent starstone, her silver hair cascading like liquid starlight around her shoulders. Her piercing emerald eyes scanned the assembly with the aloofness of someone who had seen it all before. Beside her, the Grand Vizier, an ancient Xantharian with a face like a gnarled tree trunk, cleared his throat with practiced theatrics. "Present yourselves," he commanded, his voice echoing through the hall. One by one, the suitors stepped forward. There were kings, warlords, and scions of powerful trade conglomerates. Each boasted wealth, power, or military might in an effort to impress the princess. One suitor, a towering reptilian from the Varnak Dominion, flexed his scaled arms as he recounted his victory over a rival fleet. Another, a luminescent being composed of living plasma, promised untold technological marvels. Yet, with every display of grandeur, Kalara's expression remained impassive, her gaze cold and unyielding. It wasn't arrogance or cruelty that fueled her indifference, it was exhaustion. Over the years, she had seen every conceivable variation of charm, bravado, and ostentation. None of it stirred her. As a child of royalty, she had been trained to see through superficial gestures. What she sought was something intangible, authenticity, courage, and a sense of humor that could cut through the weight of her station. But such qualities seemed rare in a universe dominated by egos and agendas. The final suitor, a metallic-skinned aristocrat from the wealthiest sector of the Vega cluster, stepped forward with a calculated smirk. "Your Majesty," he purred, his voice slick with self-assurance, "I offer you not just riches but the loyalty of my entire star fleet. Together, we could expand your empire tenfold." Kalara raised a delicate eyebrow. "And what would you expect in return?" she asked, her tone sharp. The suitor faltered, clearly unprepared for the directness of the question. He stammered something about mutual benefits, but Kalara waved him off with a sigh. "Enough," she declared. "This farce is over." A ripple of shock spread through the hall. The suitors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to leave or linger. The Grand Vizier stepped forward, his expression a mixture of concern and reproach. "Your Highness," he whispered, "if you reject them all, the Council will demand—" "I know what the Council will demand," Kalara interrupted, her voice like steel. "But I refuse to choose a consort out of obligation." As murmurs filled the air, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Heads turned as a figure pushed through the crowd, his movements lacking the grace of the court, but exuding a raw confidence. He was a human, an uncommon sight in such esteemed company. His clothes were practical and unremarkable, a worn leather jacket, a utility belt cluttered with tools, and scuffed boots that had seen better days. He carried himself with a mix of nonchalance and defiance, as if the grandeur of the palace was little more than a minor curiosity. "Who dares disrupt this assembly?" the Grand Vizier demanded, his voice tinged with outrage. The man stopped in the center of the hall, scratching the back of his head as he surveyed the room. "Name's Jack Carter," he said, his tone casual. "Captain of the Eclipse. Got a little lost on my way to the docking bay. Didn't realize I'd stumbled into a matchmaking contest." Laughter rippled through the crowd, though it was more incredulous than amused. Jack's easy demeanor was a stark contrast to the formality of the gathering. Kalara's eyes narrowed as she studied him, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "You're trespassing," the Vizier snapped, gesturing for the guards to remove him. "Hold!" Kalara commanded, raising a hand. The guards froze mid-step. "Let him speak." Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her intervention. "Well, that's generous of you, Princess. To be honest, I'm not here to impress anyone. Just passing through, Looking for a decent mechanic to patch up my ship. But since I'm already here. He glanced around the room, his gaze settling on the rejected suitors. Seems to me you've got a room full of people who don't know the first thing about what you want. Kalara's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile threatening to emerge. And you do? Jack shrugged. I've spent my life scraping by on the edges of the galaxy. I know what it's like to deal with people who think they're better than you just because they've got more resources. You're looking for someone who sees past all the fluff, right? Someone who can actually keep up with you. The room fell silent, the suitors glaring at Jack with a mix of disdain and disbelief. Kalara leaned forward, her interest now fully engaged. And what makes you think you're that someone? Jack met her gaze without flinching. I don't know if I am. But I'm not afraid to find out. The simplicity of his answer struck a chord in Kalara. For the first time that evening, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years, intrigue. She rose from her throne, her movements graceful and deliberate. Very well, Captain Carter, she said. You've earned the chance to prove yourself. The vizier sputtered in protest. Your Highness, this is highly irregular. Enough, vizier, Kalara said sharply. I am not choosing a consort tonight. But I will entertain this man's presence. Jack smirked. Entertaining's one of my strong suits. The princess turned to the assembly, her voice ringing with authority. This gathering is adjourned. You may all return to your respective sectors. The suitors departed reluctantly, their muttered complaints echoing through the hall. Kalara descended from her throne, her emerald eyes locking onto Jack's with an intensity that made his cocky grin falter. Follow me, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jack hesitated, then nodded, falling into step beside her. As they exited the great hall, Kalara couldn't help but wonder if this human, with his audacity and disarming candor, might finally offer her the escape she had been seeking from the suffocating expectations of her royal life. Kalara's private chambers were a stark contrast to the resplendent grandeur of the palace's public spaces. Here, the walls were unadorned except for shelves filled with ancient texts and holographic projections of uncharted star maps. A faint hum from an energy field resonated in the air, creating an intimate, otherworldly atmosphere. Jack Carter stood near the entrance, his rugged presence looking oddly out of place against the refined, minimalist elegance of the room. Nice digs, Jack remarked, breaking the silence. He strolled to the edge of a low table carved from obsidian and peered at the intricate carvings on its surface. Not exactly cozy, though. You ever consider a beanbag chair? Maybe some snacks? Kalara, who had been observing him with a mix of amusement and suspicion, raised an eyebrow. I didn't bring you here for interior design advice, Captain Carter. Call me Jack, he said, flashing a grin. And what did you bring me here for, Princess? She folded her arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. Your arrival tonight was unexpected, to say the least. It's rare for a human to wander this far into Xantherian space without purpose. Who says I don't have one? Jack replied, his tone casual. I just tend to keep my plans flexible. Convenient, Kalara said, her eyes narrowing. But I don't believe in coincidence. You must know the stakes at play. My choice of consort isn't just a personal matter, it's a political one. Every faction in this galaxy has something to gain or lose depending on my decision. Jack shrugged. That why you turned all those other guys down? Too much baggage? Kalara's lips tightened. Partly. They came with power, influence, and armies, but they all wanted something in return. My freedom. My compliance. My identity. And I refused to give those things away. Can't blame you for that, Jack said, nodding. Freedom's about the only thing worth fighting for. Kalara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. And what do you fight for, Captain? Jack's grin faded slightly. He leaned against the wall, his gaze dropping to the floor. Used to fight for my crew. My ship. Just trying to make it to the next day without losing anyone else. These days? Guess I'm still figuring that out. The vulnerability in his voice caught Kalara off guard. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond his bravado, a quiet, weary determination that resonated with her own struggles. She pushed off the desk and walked toward him, her emerald eyes softening. "I brought you here because you're different," she said. "You're not trying to impress me with wealth or power. You speak your mind without fear, even in a room full of people who could vaporize you with a glance. That intrigues me." Jack looked up, his grin returning. "Well, when you put it like that, I sound pretty impressive." Kalara rolled her eyes. "Don't let it go to your head." Before she could say more, a sudden, jarring sound echoed through the room, a high-pitched whine that grew in intensity. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he reached for the sidearm holstered at his belt. Kalara spun toward a console on the wall, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. "What's going on?" Jack asked, moving to her side. Kalara's expression hardened. "The palace's external sensors have been triggered. Unauthorized ships are entering Xantherian airspace." "Friends of yours?" Jack asked, already knowing the answer. "Hardly," Kalara muttered. She activated a holoscreen, revealing a live feed of the intruders, sleek, angular ships bearing the crimson insignia of the Valesan Syndicate. "They're mercenaries," she explained. "Hired guns with a reputation for indiscriminate violence." Jack frowned. "Let me guess. They're here because of you." Kalara nodded grimly. "No doubt one of the rejected suitors decided to send a message. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but they've never been bold enough to breach our defenses." "Well, they're bold now," Jack said, eyeing the screen. "How's your palace's defense grid?" "Robust, but not invulnerable," Kalara admitted. "If they deploy disruptor drones, they could disable key systems before we have a chance to counterattack." Jack's mind raced as he analyzed the situation. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but old habits died hard. "You've got a hangar, right? Something with a ship I can use?" Kalara looked at him sharply. "What are you planning?" "Just trust me," Jack said, meeting her gaze. "I've dealt with these types before. You don't want to sit back and let them dictate the fight." Kalara hesitated, then nodded. "Follow me." They moved quickly through the palace's labyrinthine corridors, passing stunned guards and staff who stared at Jack with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. The hangar was a cavernous space filled with sleek, advanced Xantherian vessels. Kalara led Jack to a compact but heavily armed starfighter, its polished surface gleaming under the hangar's lights. "This is the Starlance," she said. "It's fast, maneuverable, and equipped with cutting-edge weaponry. Can you handle it?" Jack smirked. "I've flown ships held together with duct tape and hope. This'll be a breeze." Kalara handed him a sleek data pad. "This contains the controls and targeting systems. Don't damage it, it's one of a kind." "No promises," Jack said, climbing into the cockpit. He powered up the systems, the hum of the engines vibrating through the vessel. "You staying here?" Kalara's expression hardened. "Not a chance." She climbed into the co-pilot's seat, ignoring Jack's raised eyebrows. "You don't know our airspace or the Syndicate's tactics. If you're going out there, so am I." Jack grinned. "Fair enough, Princess. Let's see what you've got." As the Starlance roared out of the hangar, Kalara relayed tactical data from the palace's defense network. The Syndicate ships were already deploying disruptor drones, their glowing spheres scattering across the sky like malevolent fireflies. "Those drones will target key systems," Kalara warned. "Shields, weapons, propulsion, nothing is safe." "Then we take them out first," Jack said, gripping the controls. He pushed the ship into a steep climb, the G-forces pressing them into their seats. "Hang on." Kalara barely had time to respond before Jack sent the Starlance into a dizzying series of barrel rolls and sharp turns, weaving through the incoming fire. His flying was unorthodox, reckless, even, but undeniably effective. Within moments, he lined up a shot and unleashed a volley of plasma bolts, destroying a cluster of drones in a fiery explosion. "Impressive," Kalara admitted, her voice tinged with genuine respect. "But don't get cocky. There are still plenty more." Jack glanced at her with a lopsided grin. Cocky's my middle name. As the battle raged on, Kalara found herself both exhilarated and unnerved. Jack's daring maneuvers defied every rule of Xantharian combat, yet they worked in ways she couldn't have anticipated. For the first time in years, she felt the thrill of uncertainty, a reminder that life, even in its chaos, could be beautiful. But the Syndicate wasn't done. Their lead ship, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons, loomed into view, its shadow casting a foreboding pall over the battlefield. Jack's grin faded. Well, that's a problem. Kalara's fingers danced across the console, pulling up data on the dreadnought. Its shields are impenetrable from the outside. We'll need to get in close, find a weak spot. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. Then let's give them a reason to focus on us. The dreadnought loomed ahead like a leviathan of metal and fire, its massive form blocking out the faint stars behind it. Jack's hands tightened on the controls as the Starlance hurtled toward the Syndicate's flagship, weaving through a storm of laser fire and swarming drones. Kalara sat beside him, her emerald eyes locked on the tactical display, her demeanor calm but her voice sharp. The dreadnought's primary weapons will tear us apart before we get close enough, she said. We need to disrupt its targeting systems. Jack arched an eyebrow. And how do you suggest we do that, Princess? Kalara's fingers danced over her console, bringing up schematics of the enemy ship. The main sensor array is located near the dorsal hull. It's heavily armored, but if we can disable it, their targeting will falter. That will buy us time. Got it, Jack replied. But getting close enough to hit that thing's going to be dicey. Then it's a good thing you've got me, Kalara said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Jack chuckled despite the tension. I'll remember that when we're dodging fireballs the size of moons. He rolled the Starlance sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma bolts. The smaller Syndicate ships swarmed around them like a cloud of angry hornets, their disruptor drones zipping dangerously close. Jack pulled the ship into a tight spiral, juking and twisting through the chaos. Kalara worked furiously at her console, deploying countermeasures that sent dazzling bursts of electromagnetic interference cascading through the void. 2 drones down, Kalara announced, her tone clipped. But more are closing in. I see them, Jack muttered. He pulled the ship into a steep dive, then climbed sharply, forcing the pursuing drones to overshoot. With a quick flick of the controls, he lined up his shot and fired. A brilliant explosion lit the darkness, taking out 3 more drones. Not bad for a human, Kalara said, a glint of approval in her voice. Thanks, Princess. Now hold on, this is where it gets interesting. Jack pushed the Starlance to its limits, engines roaring as they closed the distance to the dreadnought. The flagship loomed larger with every second, its hull bristling with gun emplacements and missile batteries. The ship's shield shimmered faintly, an almost imperceptible barrier of energy that rendered it nearly impervious to attack. Almost there, Jack said through gritted teeth. You'd better have a plan for taking out that array. Kalara's expression hardened. Leave that to me. Just get us close. The Starlance dodged another volley of fire, its shields flaring under the strain. Jack brought the ship into a tight barrel roll, narrowly avoiding a direct hit from a laser cannon. The dreadnought's dorsal hull loomed ahead, its sensor array a cluster of glowing nodes surrounded by heavy plating. Now! Kalara shouted. Jack brought the ship around, holding it steady as Kalara activated the targeting system. The Starlance's weapons locked onto the array, and Kalara unleashed a barrage of precision plasma bolts. The impacts rippled across the array, the armor buckling under the concentrated fire. The sensors sparked and fizzled before exploding in a shower of debris. The dreadnought's weapons faltered, their targeting systems momentarily blinded. Jack let out a whoop of triumph, but the celebration was short-lived. The Syndicate's smaller ships were closing in fast, their disruptor drones swarming toward the Starlance like a tidal wave. We're not out of this yet, Kalara warned. No kidding, Jack muttered. He threw the Starlance into a series of evasive maneuvers, darting through the chaos with reckless precision. The smaller ships pressed their attack, their lasers carving fiery streaks through the darkness. Kalara's voice was tense. The dreadnought's shields are still up. We need to take out the main generator. And where would that be? Jack asked, dodging another volley. Kalara brought up the schematics again, her eyes scanning rapidly. The generator is located deep within the ship, in a heavily fortified section near the core. It's protected by layers of armor and energy barriers. Getting to it will be challenging. Jack smirked. Challenging's my specialty. Kalara shot him a look. This isn't the time for bravado, Captain. Who said anything about bravado? I've got a plan. Before Kalara could respond, Jack dove the Starlance toward the dreadnought's underbelly. The smaller ships followed in hot pursuit, their weapons blazing. Jack twisted the controls, weaving through the enemy fire with hair-raising precision. He brought the Starlance in close, skimming the surface of the dreadnought's hull. What are you doing? Kalara demanded. Creating an opening, Jack replied. He fired a series of high-yield plasma charges at the hull, each impact blasting away chunks of armor. A gaping hole opened up, exposing the interior of the ship. You're insane, Kalara muttered. Maybe, Jack admitted. But it's working. He guided the Starlance into the breach, the ship narrowly fitting through the jagged opening. Inside, the dreadnought's corridors were a maze of flickering lights and automated defenses. Jack kept the ship moving, dodging turrets and sentry drones as Kalara fed him navigational data. The generator is 2 levels down, Kalara said. But the core chamber is heavily guarded. Then let's not keep them waiting, Jack said, his grin returning. The Starlance roared through the narrow corridors, its weapons blasting apart the Syndicate's defenses. They reached the core chamber, a massive, cavernous space dominated by the generator, a pulsating sphere of energy surrounded by rotating conduits. Kalara's fingers flew across her console. If we overload the conduits, the generator will destabilize. But we'll only have a few seconds to escape. No pressure, Jack muttered. He brought the Starlance into position, targeting the conduits. Kalara activated the ship's main cannons, firing a concentrated burst of plasma. The conduits sparked and crackled, their energy feeds spiraling out of control. The generator began to glow dangerously, its hum rising to a deafening pitch. Jack spun the ship around, pushing the engines to their limit as they raced back through the corridors. Behind them, the generator exploded in a blinding flash, the shockwave ripping through the dreadnought. The Starlance shot out of the breach just as the dreadnought began to collapse, its structure buckling under the force of the explosion. Jack and Kalara barely had time to register their victory before a fresh wave of Syndicate ships appeared on the horizon. Still want to stick around for the encore? Jack asked, his voice laced with adrenaline. Kalara's eyes sparkled with determination. We've come this far. Let's finish it. Jack grinned. That's the spirit, Princess. He pushed the Starlance back into the fray, ready for whatever came next. The Starlance streaked through the battlefield, its engines burning brightly against the backdrop of chaos. Behind them, the Syndicate dreadnought was reduced to a smoldering wreck, its once mighty form now a drifting hulk of molten metal and debris. But the victory was short-lived. Fresh waves of Syndicate ships filled the void, their sleek forms and coordinated maneuvers spelling out a single message: retreat was not an option. Kalara's voice was steady, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her. The palace defense grid is still compromised, and the Syndicate isn't going to back down. We need to end this now, or they'll overwhelm the entire city. Jack glanced at her, his grip on the controls firm. I was hoping you had a trump card up your sleeve. Something royal and shiny that makes them run for the hills. Kalara allowed herself a wry smile. Not every battle is won with a crown, Captain. Sometimes you have to fight dirty. Jack chuckled, though his eyes remained on the tactical display. Dirty's my specialty. So, what's the plan? Kalara leaned forward, her fingers tapping across the console as a holographic layout of the battlefield appeared. The Syndicate's forces are centralized around a command ship, there. She pointed to a massive vessel hovering at the edge of the engagement zone, surrounded by an escort of smaller ships. Take that out, and their fleet will lose coordination. They rely on centralized orders, not individual autonomy. Jack frowned. That's a lot of firepower protecting it. Kalara's tone turned grim. And they'll fight harder than ever if they know the command ship is at risk. But we don't have to destroy it completely. If we disable its communication array and propulsion systems, we can turn the tide. Jack sighed, his hands tightening on the controls. So, let me guess, we get in close, dodge 1,000 laser cannons, and shoot the thing's guts out before making a daring escape? Kalara gave him a sidelong glance. Something like that. Perfect, Jack muttered, rolling the ship into a sharp dive as a barrage of plasma fire sliced through the space they had occupied moments before. Let's see what this little beauty can do. The Starlance accelerated toward the Syndicate's command ship, cutting through enemy ranks with a combination of precision and audacity that seemed to defy logic. Jack's flying was as chaotic as ever, weaving between enemy fighters and turret fire in a dizzying dance of survival. Kalara worked the weapons systems with ruthless efficiency, each press of a button sending plasma bolts and missiles streaking toward their targets. Left flank! Kalara called out as a trio of enemy fighters closed in. Jack swung the ship into a tight spiral, dodging their fire and bringing the Starlance into position. Kalara unleashed a barrage of countermeasures, sending one fighter spinning out of control while Jack finished off the other two with well-placed shots. Nice shooting, Jack said, flashing her a grin. Kalara didn't respond, her focus locked on the command ship growing larger on the display. We're entering their defensive perimeter. Get ready. The Starlance roared toward the command ship, its shields flaring under the concentrated fire of turrets and escort ships. Jack pushed the engines to their limit, every nerve in his body attuned to the chaos around him. Kalara relayed data from the tactical interface, her voice calm and measured despite the storm of violence. The communication array is located on the upper deck, she said. We'll need to approach from below to avoid their heaviest guns. Jack nodded. Got it. Hold on. He brought the Starlance into a steep dive, skimming the underside of the command ship as turret fire exploded around them. The maneuver brought them perilously close to the enemy vessel's hull, the ship's shields crackling with energy as they brushed against the barrier. Target locked, Kalara said. Firing now. The Starlance's weapons lit up, a stream of plasma bolts ripping into the command ship's communication array. Sparks and debris erupted from the structure, and the Syndicate fleet's coordination immediately began to falter. Enemy ships broke formation, their movements erratic as they scrambled to adjust. That did it, Kalara said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. But the propulsion systems are still active. On it, Jack replied, banking hard to avoid an incoming missile. He brought the Starlance around, lining up a shot on the command ship's engines. Kalara fired another volley, the plasma bolts striking true. The engines sputtered and died, leaving the massive vessel adrift. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Not bad for a day's work. Kalara wasn't smiling. We're not done yet. The Syndicate will regroup quickly. We need to press our advantage. Jack glanced at the tactical display, where the remaining Syndicate ships were already beginning to reposition. He shook his head. These guys don't know when to quit. Kalara's eyes glimmered with determination. Then we'll teach them. With the command ship disabled, the palace's defense grid began to reassert control, targeting the remaining Syndicate ships with devastating precision. Kalara coordinated the efforts, her voice steady and commanding as she directed the palace's forces. Jack, meanwhile, kept the Starlance in the fight, his flying a masterclass in improvisation and nerve. Together, they turned the tide, the Syndicate fleet crumbling under the combined assault. As the last of the enemy ships retreated, Jack slumped back in his seat, his adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. Is it always this exciting around here? He asked, his tone half-joking. Kalara allowed herself a small smile. Not usually. But perhaps I've underestimated the value of unconventional tactics. Jack grinned. Unconventional's just a fancy word for fun. The Starlance returned to the palace, its hull scorched and battered but victorious. The hangar was a flurry of activity as mechanics and staff rushed to assess the damage and prepare for potential retaliation. Jack climbed out of the cockpit, stretching his sore muscles as Kalara joined him. "So," he said, leaning casually against the ship. "How'd I do?" Kalara regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Better than I expected. You're reckless, infuriating, and entirely too self-assured, but you're also resourceful, brave, and surprisingly capable." Jack smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Kalara stepped closer, her emerald eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his grin falter. "You've proven yourself today, Captain Carter. But this isn't over. The Syndicate will return, and when they do, I'll need allies I can trust." Jack straightened, his expression turning serious. "You've got one. Just say the word." Kalara extended her hand, and Jack took it, their grip firm and unspoken understanding passing between them. For the first time in years, Kalara felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that, perhaps, she didn't have to face the galaxy's challenges alone. As the two of them stood in the hangar, surrounded by the hum of activity and the glow of victory, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning of a partnership that would change the fate of the galaxy.